Good evening, good morning, wherever you are. Here in Glasgow, of course, the afternoon, but we also have a good audience online, so welcome to all of you as well. My name is Aaron Kramer. I'm the President and CEO of BSR, and on this afternoon, when Barack Obama has also been speaking around this time, I'm the other American, so we're very, very glad to have our former president here in Glasgow. Looking forward to a really good discussion this afternoon. And, you know, if we look back to Paris, Paris was all about ambition, and we saw a sharp rise in ambition. Glasgow is still about ambition, but also about delivery, because ambition and leadership in the real economy is what we need to deliver an inclusive net zero economy by 2050. So we are here to see the ambition loop expand. There are now more than 3,000 companies that are committed to net zero, a number that, frankly, I don't think any of us would have anticipated. We might have hoped for it, but not anticipated. And including many sectors that were previously known as hard-to-abate sectors, and we'll hear from Dalmia Cement today. We also have nearly 2,000 companies committed to science-based net zero targets, so we can see the momentum growing. We also know that setting targets, especially long-term targets, on its own is not enough. It is necessary but not sufficient. We need these targets to be underpinned by near-term decarbonization goals as well, including those that cover supply chains. We need to make sure that net zero leadership also includes dealing with residual emissions that we cannot get rid of right away. And we're starting to see some companies, and we'll hear from Microsoft, which has done this, looking to get to negative emissions. As I said, at Paris, very few companies or political entities had committed to net zero, and today the picture has changed. Question for us now is, will the same be said about climate justice? Of the more than 3,000 net zero targets that are present in the world on the part of companies, our estimate, unscientific survey, we'd love to be proven wrong, is maybe 1% of those net zero targets include mention of climate justice. So we hope that that will begin to change, and we'll see great acceleration on that as well. If that happens, and if the ambition continues and the delivery continues, we can look at COP26 as a real turning point in history, just as we did in Paris for COP21. And we're going to hear from business leaders today who are making this transition real. They demonstrate what implementation is all about. It's not always as sexy as setting a big target, but the targets don't matter if implementation doesn't happen. They have all made ambitious commitments to transform to net zero emissions aligned with the Paris Agreement, and doing that through three things amongst others: demonstrable short-term targets that can be achieved and demonstrated, real business transformation across the entirety of the company, operations, procurement, absolutely everything, and investment in going beyond mitigation, including nature-based solutions and negative emissions with quality and with demonstrable additionality. Two of the panelists we have here today are coming from companies who are part of a coalition for which we are very proud to serve as the Secretariat, Transform to Net Zero. And this is an initiative that is aiming to accelerate this transition and to demonstrate how it's done. And companies within Transform to Net Zero are sharing their experiences. We're launching today a transformation guide, one in a series, with examples from Danone, from Wipro, and from the Environmental Defense Fund, EDF, showing how we can achieve the kind of change we're trying to obtain. And those resources can be, here's a URL alert, can be found at transformtonetzero.org, transformtonetzero.org. The world outside COP, and we've heard a lot from outside the COP over the last several days, is waiting to see what we deliver. The world outside COP knows that what happens here is central, but what happens outside 365 days a year is where we make the real change happen. And so we hope that we will see ongoing ambition, resolute pursuit of that ambition, increasing investment, a focus on climate action, a focus on Scope 3, and with that, we will shift the economy into a much more not only sustainable, but also just trajectory. So with that, I invite now the discussion to get started. We're going to be kicked off by our moderator for this session, Antonia Gavel, who is the head of climate action at the World Economic Forum. Thanks, Antonia.
Great. Thank you, Aaron, for that excellent introduction and overview of what we're here to discuss today. As Aaron said, I hope to kind of help facilitate a conversation really over the next 45 minutes or so about this important topic. There's obviously a lot to cover, so I'm hoping that we can kind of take this in a few components, right? So one is, of course, leadership in setting these long-term targets. I would say that's kind of minimum baseline. We know where we need to get to by 2050. And I think what people are rightly looking at and demanding is, okay, how does that then translate into how we deliver by 2030 to make sure that we're on that pathway for 2050? And therefore, how does that translate into what investment decisions and business model transformation decisions are happening today to set us on that correct course? I think I'm really honored to be joined here by a number of business leaders who are indeed part of the forefront of trying to drive this ambitious transformation within the business community, which of course then needs to scale across the entire economy in order to have the impact. So we'll touch on some of that as we go through the conversation. And we will, of course, have time for questions from the audience, both in the room here. So, you know, as we're discussing, think of some good questions you want to pose to the group on stage, but also we're joined by a live audience who can also, you know, put your hand up and ask questions, and we'll try to link those into the conversation as well. So with that, let me just briefly introduce our panel here. We have Roberto Marquez, who is the Executive Chairman and Group CEO of Natura & Co. With us today, we have Mahindra Singhi, Managing Director and CEO of Dalmia Cement, joining us from India. Michelle Lancaster, Director of Sustainability Solutions and Partnerships from Microsoft, so welcome. And of course, last but not least, Lorena Della Giovanna, or as you said, Lorena San is okay too, joining us as Vice President and Executive Officer from Hitachi. So it's wonderful to have you all here with us today. So I think the first question that I'll sort of pose to you in turn is really for the audience to maybe hear a little bit about your journey as a business leader in really setting that 1.5 transformation journey and target. You know, as CEO, maybe we'll start with you, if that's okay, Roberto. How have you gone about taking Natura from to that place of really setting a true commitment to achieving 1.5, of course, trajectory by 2050 to kind of maintain that threshold, but what are you then doing in that more near-term pathway in order to set the business on course in that direction? If you could start there, and also any sort of personal reflections in that respect of transforming the business as CEO.
Yeah, so thank you for the invitation. Good to be here with all of you to talk about transforming to net zero. So, you know, Natura, it's not a new topic for Natura and any the companies that are part of the group. Natura, The Body Shop, Avon, and Aesop. 4 businesses that are really purpose-driven, and all of them founded by visionary individuals that always understood that business can and should be force for good. And the whole notion of environment and how to actually balance all stakeholders is kind of part of the DNA. So it's almost difficult not to think about it from that perspective. It's really core to what we do as part of our strategic planning. It's part of how we actually remunerate our top executives, not just on financial indicators, but how we are doing it regarding to environment. But in related to net zero, we actually set a pretty bold target for us of actually getting to net zero by 2030, which is 20 years ahead of the commitment from the UN. And most important, actually on scope 1, 2, and 3, which, as you know, more than 80% of the emissions actually falls into scope 3 for us. So the first thing that we are doing is setting very specific metrics, not just by 2030, because it's easy for people to say, I'm gonna quit smoking by 2050, right? But the problem is how we're gonna get to that. And it's not just setting very long-term goals, but it's creating a clear framework, what needs to happen year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5, in order to get us a chance to get to net zero by 2030. And even that, I would say, is still pretty daunting. But the first task is creating the baseline, and we are working with science-based targets to make sure that we establish the baseline, understand what are the key offenders. We already know that, packaging, ingredient, transportation, printed materials are call it the key offenders. And based on that, then we establish, metrics. We establish a framework, what needs to happen, year 1, year 2, year 4, year 5. So that discipline, I think, and for us is being really important because it also brings a unintended consequence, which I think is pretty, exciting, which is innovation. By setting those targets and those goals, what ends up happening is the organization becomes much more open to different solutions, different way of doing things in order to deliver against those metrics. So in summary, I would say setting bold targets, make sure that you're tracking and creating a clear a framework in how to make it operational, not just a year 10 or year 20 or year 30, but then holding people accountable, making sure that those metrics is part of how you run the business and not something on a separate organization or a group of individuals that are responsible. This needs to start with the board, needs to start with the executive management team to make sure that we can get traction.
Absolutely, and maybe, I think the way that you frame that, Roberto, is incredibly logical, right? I think it holds an incredibly logical kind of pathway. I think some could argue, and I'm sure you would say the same, it's easier said than done, right? So I'd love to maybe follow up on that to say, okay, so now that we have a clear kind of set of hotspots, metrics, we know what we want to do, what would you say are sort of the top, let's say, priority sort of challenges or areas of fundamental transformation that then as a result you need to drive within your business?
So one example, as I mentioned, is packaging, right? So packaging is one key component of the emissions on scope 3 for us. So then it's really working with the business, how we institute recyclable, compostable, biodegradable packaging, how we really drive innovation, how we start working with our design to value, with our scientists, with our packaging engineers to really deliver against some of those challenges. But the difference is, again, once you decided that that's what we are expecting, then it drives a very interesting conversation about innovation and sometimes open innovation, asking for help. Some of those answers we don't have from within Natura & Co, but we needed to reach out to our supply chain partners, to other companies, even some competitors. We actually know that in order to get to some target, especially again in packaging and ingredients, even if we're talking the same industry like cosmetics, unless we bring other players that are competing in the same space, we're not going to get critical mass to convince some of the suppliers to make the investment that we need to have. So in some of those aspects, it's more about collaboration than competition here. And that is also a shift in mindset that in some of those topics, it's not so much about who's going to get there first, but making sure that we're all getting to that end point.
Yeah, and I think we'll certainly kind of come back to the point about collaboration and actually achieving scale, because I think that's a critical component of this as well. Maybe, Hindra, if I can turn to you. I think joining us from India, cement, I think you don't like to call it a hard to abate sector. It is a possible to abate or happy to abate sector, which is of course, it is a fundamental part of the economy, but also we know that it does represent a significant amount of global emissions. And would love to just kind of hear from your perspective that journey of how we need to kind of course, decarbonize some of these industrial sectors. And you have set bold targets, and you are also a founding partner of the First Movers Coalition to look at investing in transformation solutions today. Could you maybe share with the audience some of your experience, and also kind of, let's say, as I asked and challenged a little bit on, not just what's the pathway, but what are really the big kind of areas that you're pushing in order to help make that transformation a reality today?
Thanks, Antonia, and happy afternoon to everyone. It's a great matter of pleasure to share the thoughts of habit sector cement, and more particularly about my company. As a business leader and as a human leader, it has been a great journey of, I would say, last 8-10 years, in which we could understand the impact of CO2 which it would be making on cement sector and my company. And accordingly, we created vision which said that we have to evoke pride in all stakeholders through sustainability, innovation, values. And then we created a philosophy of clean and green is profitable and sustainable. All efforts have been made to ensure that yes, we take right action at right time, which ensures sustainability also, and in time to come, it also reduces the cost of production also. And I am happy to share that when we used few initiatives like how we become most energy efficient, how we can replace certain quantum of limestone and clinker with the waste material of other sector like fly ash and slag, and also how we can also use renewable energy. We could become one of the lowest carbon footprint cement company in global cement world. In fact, CDP, when they came out with the global cement report, they identified Dalmia Cement as #1 for taking efforts on low carbon transition. So the point is that we tried to change the mindset of our own people and then all stakeholders, and always be kept in mind that whatever I do, whatever my organization does, that should also fit in better for future generation also. Now in 2018, when we became lowest carbon footprint cement company, we again brainstormed and then came out with the thought that why not we become carbon negative, not net zero. And in 2018, when no manufacturing company was thinking about having this commitment, and there was no compulsion to make this commitment, but to ensure that we chart out our action plan, we work on those levers which can make cement also to be thought as possible to abate. And good part is that now, if we look at last few months, the many global cement companies have come together now to commit for bringing down CO2 emissions by 2030, making cement and concrete as a net zero by 2050 also. So we did few important things. One, we identified certain levers which will bring it to year by year, reducing carbon footprint and then carbon negative. One of the important was to transform our thermal electricity to renewable electricity by 2030. We have already started taking actions. Second and most important was also the replacement of fossil fuel. How we can avoid 100% fossil fuel by 2035. We have already started action by using industrial waste, sustainable biomass, municipal waste, and few such other waste which can slowly replace fossil fuel. And everybody hates fossil fuel, and rightly also, so we would replace it fully. And third, how we can be most efficient in terms of using power and heat for cement process. I'm happy to share that our power consumption per ton of cement is one of the most efficient in global cement world. And fourth, the toughest task was to abate, to ensure that the CO2 which gets emitted from cement process, that is because of chemical reaction, how to restrict that. So restriction is not possible, but it's possible to capture it. And then if you are able to capture in a right way, as well can also convert it into a useful material, and it can act as a product which can be a green product. So what we have decided now, that we should implement carbon capture and utilization technology. Good part is that Asian Development Bank has now identified the CCU technology as technologically and economically feasible, and now we would be working on it, and then that would make the cement first net zero and then carbon negative. Important aspect for implementing this whole carbon negative roadmap is, one, every year, every 5th year, we have to go on measuring it, go on monitoring it. And so we have the mechanism in place by which we do measure and monitor every year by third party that what's our carbon dioxide emission. And that is done compared with the target which we have already set in 3 years back. And I'm happy to also share that whatever we had targeted, like 522 kg per ton of cement in March 21, we could reach to 492. We have also decided that by 2025, we would not be producing high carbon cement and we will be producing only low carbon cement. And thirdly, we have also committed that all our investment would be in green technologies, whether it's a green power, green fuel, or the green cement manufacturing. So this all would lead us to net zero. We are already committed for science-based target. We are already committed for race to net zero 1.5 degree. And in addition to this, one more point which I would like to highlight is that we also started working on conserving and harvesting the water. So we became 5 times water positive in 2018, now 12.4 times water positive, and our target is that whatever water we consume, we should save 20 times by 2025.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, I think this is really a great example of industry leadership, and I think we'll come back to this, and I think this is the question that I keep asking and will keep asking is, we need these examples like yourself within the broader industry to demonstrate that it is possible, right? And then the challenge, I think, for us on this panel is how do we then scale, let's say, much more broadly to the entire industry and the economies more broadly as well. But I think exactly this sort of lighthouse examples of this is how we do it. As you said, here's the plan. We need to follow the plan and we need to track the plan to make sure that we're on course, and there's certainly levers that will make that easier as well in terms of achieving scale. So let's hope we can come back to that. So thank you for that overview. If I can maybe now turn to you, Michelle. Of course, Microsoft has very much been driving an incredibly ambitious climate transition in your industry as well. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that, as well as, again, just sticking with this theme of what does that mean today? What does that mean in the near term for how we make sure that we're truly on course for that transformation?
Yeah, thank you for that. And most of you know Microsoft is a global technology company. In some ways, that gives us an immense amount of responsibility. We have a lot of emissions, especially as there's more cloud consumed. We have more responsibility to abate that. We also have a tremendous opportunity and really an obligation to use that opportunity for good, because we are, depending on what day you look at it, either the world's most valuable or the second most valuable company. And that means that we have emissions, but we also have a capital balance sheet. And so everything that we have done has been, how do we make this work for Microsoft in a way that is scalable and replicable for others? Because it shouldn't just be the world's 1% of companies that can do this. We need 100% of all of the world's companies to engage. And so for Microsoft, like Natura, we are not new to this. We've been working on sustainability since really 2009 when we set our first emissions reduction target. We were carbon negative across scopes 1, 2, and our business airline travel since 2013. But we realized it wasn't enough. And so about 2 years ago, we asked ourselves 3 questions. One, were we doing enough? If you are a company or a country in business today and the answer to that question is yes, you are doing something wrong, because it is clear that none of us are doing enough right now. Then the question is, well, what could Microsoft uniquely do to make that better? Well, the answer was deploy all of our levers of influence, our capital, our operations, our supply chain, but also our core competency, which is technology, against these problems, both to solve them for us and then to solve them for others. And that really culminated in an announcement that we made about 2 years ago with a commitment to become carbon negative, so across all 3 scopes by 2030, and to remove all of our historical emissions by 2050. And I just want to unpack that for a second. So for Microsoft, that really starts with a reduce, replace, and then remove strategy. And I think it's important that even as a company that's investing a lot of money into carbon removal, we still start with that reduction strategy. We're including renewable energy, and then we are cutting our scope 3 emissions by 55%. And then, and only then, do we get to actually start to tap into our removal bucket. With that strategy, in place for about a year. I think I'd echo what other folks have said. The importance of 2030 can't be stated. You mentioned smoking. I think about it all the time, maybe just because I've been my COVID experience, but it's sort of like buying a gym membership and saying you want to lose 20 pounds and never going to the gym. Unless you have a near-term goal and the materials and the facilities to do it, it's going to be really hard to get there. And that's what we realized, is that right now there are 3 big problems for Microsoft in the world to get to net zero. There is a lack of consistency across meaning of net zero. A lot of us have targets. If you could ask, I bet if you did a poll in the hallway right now and you asked 5 people walking by you what net zero meant to them, you would get 5 different answers. That's not very effective to drive global change on a global problem in the span of about 10 years. So we need to have both a common taxonomy and a common way to do that. And unsurprisingly, a technology company, we think about that second M is really around measurement. And I think that measurement word is really intentional for us. I come from a communications background, so that is not surprise. But if we're all talking about the same thing in the same way, we all need to be measuring it in the same way. And right now, carbon measurement has really been a carbon accounting exercise. You sort of count what you know. We're not really measuring actual carbon. We're not really measuring it on a regular basis across the board. We're using CO2e as a proxy for a lot of these things. We're using life cycle emissions. If you want to get to net zero, not just on a ledger sheet, but actually at an atmospheric level, we need to do a much better job of measuring carbon. And that leads us to the third M that we've been looking at, is that there's just simply no way the world is going to get to net zero without much more effective markets. And I don't want to draw an artificial distinction between financial markets and global offset markets or offsets and removals. All of them need to change. The way that we value nature, the way that we value water, the way that we value ecosystem services, and the way that we quantify carbon removal or carbon offset all have to change at a similar pace, really backed by data, in order to get those markets to function. We're in this very ironic situation where the world is kind of awash in capital, and we're all terrified that it's not going to go in the right place. And we have a very unique moment in time to make sure that we're developing the instruments and building the communities, so we're all looking at the same goal, and all of the pledges that have been made here, those dollars are all actually moving to things that get us out of plenary sessions and into actually a path to net zero.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that last point in particular, I mean, I think that everybody, at least on this stage, recognizes that the sort of fundamental underpinnings of the economy, if that was adjusted through proper market valuation, carbon pricing, let's just say would make the job a lot easier. Of course, achieving that in practice across the globe is easier said than done, I think, like we said before, but we are seeing positive signals and progress in that direction of trying to really bring a proper pricing system, into some of these externalities, because again, that just makes the whole thing move much more quickly as well. I mean, I think just maybe, Michelle, coming back to you, just like I asked others, is what would you say is sort of the 1 or 2 key areas that are perhaps the most challenging that you really need to resolve for today? Again, kind of, looking at the 2030 plan, the 2050 plan, what is it that really you're trying to push and move today that is perhaps the hardest to drive?
Yeah, I think that there are really 2 places that we hone in on. One is Scope 3 emissions, depending on whether you're using market or location-based accounting. It's either about 75 or 97% of Microsoft's emissions. We've done a great job on reduction. We've done a great job on renewable energy. We have our work cut out for us on Scope 3, and as a technology company, we think if we don't have great data on Scope 3, we're really concerned about what everybody else's data looks like. And so when we look at Scope 3, we know that we have, a paucity of data. We have, even when we have data that, covers our quantity, the quality of data varies widely across those categories and across what you're getting. There's sort of this don't trust, don't verify system right now, I would say, going on with Scope 3 data that needs to change pretty rapidly. And so we're worried about that data because we're worried about making sure that we take the right actions right now. And it's not, we're not stuck in an analysis paralysis situation, but really figuring out with enough data to take those smart actions on Scope 3 is a big challenge for us. It's about 16 million metric tons of our portfolio. And the last thing is markets. We think we see a pathway to get us to our 2030 carbon negative targets. We're on a second round of an RFP to secure carbon removal this year, about 1.6 million metric tons. But what we saw last year is that of the 300 RFP responses we got, we thought only about 1.8 million of those tons were quality enough to purchase. We purchased 1.3 million, and since then, about 100 companies have made commitments and are starting to look at carbon removal. And so there's a lack of availability, there's still a lack of quantity, and this is sort of that, are the markets going to be able to scale rapidly enough at a quality level that is sufficient to get us to our goals, again, not just on a ledger sheet, but actually in seeing a net reduction in atmospheric gases.
Good points. If I could turn to you, Lorena, I mean, as a technology company, of course, you know, from a different perspective, type of technology solution provider for some of these types of net zero decarbonization, you know, infrastructure solutions. Could you tell us a little bit about how at Hitachi you're driving this transformation? And also, again, just, you know, trying to drive this point of, you know, everybody has now these net zero 2050 decarbonization targets. How are you looking at that in the near term, and what are some of the key challenges that you see as critical to overcome?
Yeah. Can you hear me? Yes, thank you. Let's say that we play this role in both sides of this topic. From one side, we wanted to be a role model in the way we lead our operation, and at the same time, we wanted to be part of the solution of our customers and the governments. Hitachi is a very complex company because it's a company operating in so many different fields. We are present in almost all the markets globally, and we have a lot of manufacturing sites, from rail to automotive, from construction machinery to healthcare, so it's very complex. And we have been developing and offering innovation and developing cutting-edge technology, product, information technology, operation technology, over 100 years, not just for increasing our business, but the focus has always been, let's make our society better. Let's try to solve these social challenges. And if we look at the climate change, and we all know that is the bigger challenge the society is facing, we told to ourselves, okay, it's really our great opportunity to bring all our capabilities together and try to develop solutions that are not just for our internal operation, because at the end, we look at our complete value chain, and 86% of our emissions are for our products and services after they are sold. And we said, let's really look at all these capabilities that we have and find solutions. So internally, we have defined a target for 2030, endorsed by the Science-Based Target, and for our internal operation, and by 2050 for the whole value chain. And we have also linked the target of environment to the executive compensation, because we think that we have to show a strong commitment. The plan is linked to the midterm management plan, which is reviewed every 3 years. So we are tracking, and we do for all the factories around the world. Of course, we try to have a global standard, but because we are operating in so many different industries, and in many different countries, we cannot apply the same solution. So we look at energy conservation, we look at renewable, we look at energy management system, we look at any other kind of consultation which can speed up this transition. We do for the procurement, and we are already engaging with our supply chain. We have around 30,000 suppliers globally. So again, it's another big challenge because they are really part of this journey. We do in the production, as I mentioned, through a number of measures, including the internal carbon pricing. We do with our customers, really sitting down with them to try to develop efficient product, to try to provide audit solution, energy management solution, renewable. So we really are trying to do across the whole value chain, and we track year by year. The main challenge, I would say, is because Hitachi is quite complex, is first of all to try to find an alignment within all the industries and the business, and especially also be aligned with the country, because in some countries we need also the policy maker to support.
Great. No, thank you. I mean, the common thing that I think I heard everybody talk about was Scope 3 and suppliers or customers, right? Which often then touch on the scope 3. I think I want to maybe shift us from challenge to kind of positive opportunity, because I think, as you were saying, we can't be stifled by the challenges or kind of paralyzed by the lack of data and analysis. We broadly know where we need to go. We broadly know the solutions, so we have to kind of keep moving in that direction, even if it's not, let's say, perfect. But this reality of, call it scope 3, kind of partnering with either the sort of consumers or the suppliers is where, let's say, the biggest opportunities lie in terms of decarbonization. And as, let's say, global companies, of course, you all have incredible reach, or call it footprint, kind of in either direction. And I think, you know, Aaron spoke at the beginning about this critical reality of partnering to transform with suppliers around the world, and we're here at the COP and talking about adaptation and resilience. In order to support transformation around the world, we need to collaborate and partner with suppliers around the world to put money and investment from also the private sector into that transformation journey in markets where, for example, the energy mix isn't yet decarbonized. And so how as companies, can you play that leadership role and really be part of that journey? Because in a sense, it could arguably be easier to say, well, look, I'm hitting my net zero decarbonization target by 2030 because I've now sort of chosen suppliers who today are fully decarbonized and my job is done, but then you are at risk of leaving some of those key players and markets behind. So I just maybe want to kind of hear any reflections or reactions, perhaps if you want to kick us off. Roberto, on this sort of, you know, we call it scope 3, it sounds very kind of technocratic, but it's ultimately about transforming the entire global supply base or consumer base of a lot of the industries. What is the partnership model that is working to take that forward?
Yeah, no, listen, it's a huge task, right? So I don't know any of us, even in this event, which is pretty, by the way, overwhelming, which is, I think there's a good thing about it, is we get the private sector, governments all here and working together. But unless we get very specific about deliverables, will be just another show and, you know, pony show, which is always the watch out, right? But going back to your question, so first, you know, before being customers or consumers, they are citizens. And if you think within that lenses, how do we engage them? How do you bring them along the journey? How do we make them understand why using a refill package is better than a plastic package? How do you feel that, or teach them and educate them that eventually using a different form of a product for a soap or a shampoo might be a better, you know, impact on the environment versus what they normally use and grew up with? So, and the citizens, they want to engage, they want to understand. They also have families, they all understand, you know, the impact in the environment. So instead of just treating them as people who are buying your product or using your products, you know, inviting them to become part of the solution as well as citizens. It is a good way to potentially, you know, drive more innovation quicker. You know, I mentioned, for example, working with your competitors. So within the cosmetic industry, we create a consortium with Unilever, L'Oreal, LVMH, to create a scoring system on the product that tells the impact on the environment. It's almost like, think about your sunscreen protection, right? So you buy level 15, 30, no matter which brand you buy, you know the protection you're getting. So if you think about and extrapolate to a scoring system on the products in a consistent way that the consumers / citizens will understand what they're buying, that's going to help. It's going to start moving the needle of really closing the loop, especially on scope 3. And the same thing with the suppliers, really bringing them along the journey, you know, explaining what are the challenges and make sure that they feel that they are part of this ecosystem. So the more we work end-to-end, I think the faster we're really going to be able to get where we need to get to.
Yeah. Maybe just, maybe it's not a provocation, but how do we get to a point from putting the onus on the citizen to make a choice based on information amongst a whole lot of decisions and information that they have to make, to putting the onus on either the company or on for the regulator because the standard has been set. Is that something we need to kind of get to in terms of scale, recognizing that there will always be market players out there who might not have the same, let's say, value base in order to kind of do the things that you're describing?
Yeah, no, for sure. Listen, I don't think it's one actor that will have all the answers, either the customers or the company or the supply chains of the government. I do think that, again, this all stakeholder approach is super important. So it takes a village. And in this case, it takes the entire world marching with the same goal, right? Because if it is just the industry or a company or a government or just the customers, I don't think we're going to be able to succeed.
So it's everything at the same time and very quickly,
Right.
I think is our challenge.
But what was said with very clear definition, right?
Yeah.
Because right now, I don't think there is that clarity, which makes it even harder.
Yeah. Do you want to pick up on that, Michelle?
Yeah, we love alliteration at Microsoft, so sorry, bear with me. You got 3 M's, now you're getting 3 E's. But I do think it picks up on that, and I think whether you're a consumer or whether you're a company, we really think about it across this ecosystem. You need to engage with those that are already there. So your eco-minded consumers that want that information and will make a preferential purchasing decision on that. We know that that's not everybody, but it's a growing pool finally. So we need to really engage the ones that we already have. We need to educate them the next line, because we know that there are a lot of sort of, I refer to them as sustainability curious companies. They are there, they want to set a target, they're a little afraid, same thing with consumers. So how do you demystify this process? How do you make it easier? How do you provide playbooks like what the Transform to Net Zero group is doing with these transformation guides? They're really intended to be playbooks to make it easier for people to take that first step and then the next step. And then finally, the 30 is maybe unpopular, but it's necessary. There is a group of people that you're never going to be able to persuade and bring along on that journey, and that's where enforcement comes in. We changed our supplier code of conduct to require emissions reporting when we set our carbon negative target. We're on a path towards making sure that we're counting all of that and that their emissions reporting is both up to our standards and that they are including having a reduction target. And I think there need to be, that we need to think about carrots and sticks across the board. There are a whole lot of people that are ready to move with the right amount of information. We should meet them where we are, and we should evangelize them. Maybe there are 4 E's along the way, but there are also, there are going to be some more difficult decisions around enforcement and moving those things forward. And I think we can look at that on preferential supplier purchasing. We can also look at that on the flip side, as you mentioned, Antonia, is that, we have done an analysis of our scope 3. We know that a ton of that is electricity. So we would like to provide incentives for those that can change, but we can't shut those people out. We are going to build data centers in Malaysia, whether or not Malaysia has renewable energy, because that is where the cloud is needed. And so it's then becoming that collaborative system. But I think it starts with data and education of the coalition of the willing, growing the coalition of the willing, and then using the might and the force of a larger coalition of willing to drag the rest of the world along with us.
Could you maybe just pick up on this piece about partnership? Because as you said, when you set within your kind of supply regulations requirements, as you say, either to report or to kind of adhere to certain standards, how have you gone about that partnership journey in your value chain? I mean, you mentioned the example of Malaysia, but could you just, because for me, this is such an important part, I think, of the transition story that I think there is such an incredible role for businesses to play. If you just maybe spend a minute on that.
Yeah, and really quickly, I think, because what I'm about to say, the more I talk, the more ironic it will be, is that we listened, quite honestly. I think it's something that we don't do enough of in the climate space in general. I think that's been my favorite part of this COP so far. We've done a lot less talking and a lot more listening. I think we've done a lot more learning as a result of that. And that's what we did. We sat down and talked with 200 of our top suppliers. We talked about their concerns. We talked about what they needed. We talked about what they wanted specifically from Microsoft and what they wanted from other people. And then from there, we had a much better base of knowledge about what a roadmap to engage, again, that top 200. So most dependent on us for spend, Roberta mentioned, we're not always going to be, we're a very large company, but we're not always the biggest purchaser from all of these companies. But for those that really depend on our dollars, we had those conversations. We listened a lot. And out of that, we started to build out some new supplier guides. And we've also started to do things like partner with the World Bank IFC to provide low-cost loans with far lower financial risk to some of our suppliers. Because while I love a good guide as the proud daughter of 2 public school teachers, I love that education piece, but our suppliers are not slow on moving because they have a reading comprehension problem. They have a access to finance problem, and we need a little bit of column A and a little bit of column B to unlock that finance piece.
Yeah, no, and I think this is critical. It's sort of the commitment from the buyers to partner with the suppliers in the markets, but actually mobilize the finance, both from your kind of purchasing commitments, but then from the broader community. I mean, as you say, there's no lack of finance in the ecosystem. It's about putting the money in the right place and for that right transformation pathway. But again, not over 2040, over the next 5 years. And I think that's the critical challenge. If I could come back to you, sort of just building on this discussion about really kind of transforming the supply base. I mean, you already talked about some of the very specific kind of measures that you're taking within the business, but how are you also bringing kind of the broader industry with you in that respect?
Yes. First, I would like to say that as far as, say, customer awareness is required or consumer awareness is required, I think a lot of work is to be done by both cement sector as well as the construction sector. And in that, even government can also play a very important role to come out with some green product procurement policy in which each one of the government, each one of the builders, each one of the consumers, they ask for low carbon cement. So that will help in making more and more low carbon cement and low carbon concrete. Second, in supply chain, definitely we have started making action, though for cement sector, scope 3 emissions are very little, but at the same time, what we have done is that we have educated the supplier, like the companies who are generating waste like fly ash from power plant to slag, that once they do it in the proper way, handle it in proper way and supply to us, then definitely we can take care of their waste, and at the same time we can also make a low carbon cement. Secondly, now the new step which we have taken is to collect the municipal waste of various towns and cities, and now today if I talk of 25 cities, municipal waste is being taken by us. Again, there the more education is required, how it can be collected in the right way, processed in the right way, and delivered in the right way. So that would be a very big step, particularly in developing country like India, where so far we didn't have that culture, but in last few years, after our PM announced about Clean India, Green India, this is happening. And third one would be that how we use the wasteland of the government and then convert it into useful land, which can also help in creating rural employment, but at the same time, that can also help in replacing fossil fuel. And lastly, I would say the supply chain can also be in terms of using the captured carbon dioxide and captured carbon. So that can be done by having partnership with the user companies like fertilizer company, like protein company, like textile company, like petro companies. So there it can play a very important role. So in totality, each one of us will have to participate with each other, collaborate with each other, and then the commitment which we have been making on these fronts, that will get fructified. And lastly, if I can say, the green finance and international carbon market would play a very, very important role in pushing ahead and also maybe sometime advancing ahead the commitment of our carbon neutral and carbon negative by 2040. So once green finance is made available, international carbon market is in place, definitely we can work faster and we can implement clean technology faster, and that would also help the supply chain also.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, that's great. I mean, I think in particular in the cement sector, is what between 50 and 60% of cement is procured by government. Is that right, about that globally? And so this notion of actually policy levers and procurement policy is incredibly important, in addition, of course, to what you were just describing. And I think the thread in there also that I picked up on certainly was this notion of a circular economy, the intersection of all these different players to start to kind of make better use and value of all the waste materials within the manufacturing kind of industrial process that you have, but also kind of at the back end of it is a huge opportunity that, again, if we have the right innovations and technologies, we can bring the costs down to actually facilitate some of those types of partnerships and transactions that 10 years ago wouldn't have been possible.
In fact, now, the one big initiative, which is industrial deep decarbonization initiative, which is being taken now by India and UK together, along with also lead IT initiative, which is being taken by India and Sweden together. So they are now framing policy for green product procurement.
Yeah.
Once that comes into the picture, then definitely all would be not only motivated, but maybe compelled also to, one, implement clean technologies and then produce the low carbon product also.
Yeah.
And the way now SMI of Prince Charles, they have been also taking those actions. Then First Mover Coalition, they would also be motivating companies to go for clean technology implementation. Thank you.
So we need these sort of collaborative initiatives which then incentivize and drive policy as well as finance into some of the solutions. Sure. Can I turn to you now, Lorena, just for your thoughts on this, kind of really looking at the transformation and partnership of the supply base in Scope 3?
As I mentioned before, we have almost 30,000 suppliers, and we just published the new guidelines as well. But I would like to do a little step ahead, that if we really wanted to achieve the decarbonization, we have not just to look at the supplier chain. So the approach we are having is to involve all the stakeholders in a co-creation approach since the innovation stage. So we engage the supplier, but we engage the customers, we engage the academy, because the solution that you have to bring in the markets are much more complex. And we have realized that just looking at that side is not enough. Also to mobilize the private funding investment and the government investment, you really need to have the whole ecosystem involved. So we have a global procurement team, we have a local procurement team, because again, we cannot really looking at just a global framework. However, this is not, it's not enough just to look at that side. And we are doing in all the sectors we are operating. So if we have, for example, to develop a sustainable train, of course the supply chain is important because we try to use as much as possible recycled material. But then you have to look at the passenger experience as well. You have to look at what kind of infrastructure you need. So it's really the entire ecosystem that is important to put in place. And the two key areas for us are innovation and collaboration. And that's what we are really driving this decarbonization program within Hitachi across all the sectors on these two topics.
Great. I think innovation, collaboration, markets, kind of partnership also with the citizens as well. I think we have a few minutes here also for questions. So I'm just looking at the floor to see if there's any questions. If you do have any questions, you can put your hand up, and there's 4 microphones kind of set up here around the room. You're welcome to kind of jump up. Please, go ahead.
Thank you very much. John Scheidler from Future Past in the United States. I'm also here as a observer delegate from the International Organization for Standardization, ISO, and I'm a member of a working group developing a new standard, ISO 14068, on carbon neutrality. Michel mentioned the issue of the quality of carbon offsets, and this is a topic that we are looking at in the standardization process, because if one is going to claim to be carbon neutral, and if offsets are going to play any role in determining that an organization is carbon neutral, we then feel like we need to say something about which offsets may qualify. So I would like to ask Michel and any of the other members of the panel, what criteria do you think we should take into account when setting standards for carbon offsets to be used in carbon neutrality declarations? Thank you.
Thank you. Super appreciate that question. I think when we put out our RFP, and I should mention too, we used avoided offsets 4 years, we switched to removals, which is still, I use air quotes in that because the distinction between those things is not really well understood, and we kind of made up our own rules. So let's keep talking about standards. I can explain what we've done, and I think it's important across the board, whether you are looking at offsets around neutrality or removals for negative. They're all of the same things I think we know now. There needs to be longevity and durability. Really challenging in the offset marketplace. We're in the Pacific Northwest, and one of the large-scale forestry projects we purchased under our RFP was, singed. We were pretty lucky, but you look at forestry, that's a little challenging when you look at longevity and durability. Soil, we know, is incredibly important, but incredibly poorly understood right now about the actual sequestration capabilities over a long period of time. And if forests are hard, soil is even harder because you till it every year and potentially even multiple times in a season. That's kind of led us onto that engineering path. But I think the most important thing that we think about across the board, again, sorry to be a boring, broken record, is the data that goes around it. What we learned first and foremost about why we wanted to get out of the avoided offset market was that we were really relying on just certification standards to tell us all that we needed to know. And those certification standards are not anywhere close to tell you what that project is. It'll tell you the project of origin, it'll tell you the type, and it'll tell you what somebody else went out and estimated. We need a lot more information attached to those actual offsets and to be able to trade them in a tokenized way. Sorry to be a technocrat, but it's comes with territory, you guys. But I think there's a need for more detailed information, more machine learning and artificial intelligence that can help us verify all of the on-the-ground soil. If we're requiring on-the-ground sensor sense and detection for everything, it's going to be very expensive to scale up the market. So I really think we need a lot more data about the actual specific projects. That data needs to be specific to the sequestration capabilities of that project, and it needs to adequately include the risks that we know that are inclusive of a changing environment as that moves forward.
Thank you, Michelle. And thanks for the great question. Of course, an important discussion happening here at COP is really the credibility, durability of some of these, important investments as well. There's a question from the floor, but if anyone wants to kind of jump in on that point as well.
No, I would add that besides the durability on longevity, impact on soil, I would say impact on nature. One very important aspect that I think we needed to absolutely, increase awareness. There is no way that we can get to net zero if we don't halt and revert the deforestation that is being happening across major forests in the globe. So a call to action here is from a process standpoint also is how we make sure that we can stop deforestation, start using nature-based solutions as a way for us to get to that. So I would only add that other variable in terms of impact and nature as a criteria.
Great, thank you. There's another question from the floor here.
Hi there. Colin Alden, University of Oxford, University of Bristol, and Sant'Anna in Italy. This is actually linked to the previous question. So what role could mechanism based on Article 6, we're talking about internationally transferable mitigation outcomes, or whether it will be a CDM plus system, whatever will emerge out of it, what role could such a mechanism play in establishing standards for reductions, and how important would it be for achieving your own ambitions?
I would say it will play a very important role, and more particularly for developing countries. So many projects which are otherwise not workable or feasible financially, that will get supported by international carbon market. And once these projects are set up with the proper mechanism, proper verification, then that will play a very important role, not only for that company, but for all such companies and all such sectors to implement such projects. And that's why I think international carbon market would be very, very important to develop clean technologies implementation in developing countries. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other inputs on that?
I think you needed to create the bridge.
Go ahead.
I think that it's important to create the bridge, which is done by the policies, between all the private investments that are available and the funding granted by the government, because the government, especially for the development countries, will continue to provide public funding. The problem is, how do you deploy in the right way in order to ensure that the emerging countries and the emergence economy can really achieve the net zero society in time, like all the other countries, with the right funding and the right technology. So you need policies and a clear framework to achieve it. Because everybody's saying finance is there, technology is there, but not enough. And again, you need to invest further. But the point is, you need policies framework, especially for the emerging economy.
There's another question from the floor. We'll take one or two more. From that side, sorry. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Nat, a business journalist from Malaysia, DH Malaysia. So I just have a question. Just in this hall this morning, NGOs were basically criticizing companies for making net zero greenwashing promises that primarily rely on carbon offsets and removals without actually reducing emissions. So my question is actually for, from the business perspective, is it possible to reach net zero without carbon offsets at the moment? For example, could the money be spent on emissions reduction technologies like carbon capture, which are quite expensive right now? So we'd love your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Does anyone want to start with that one? Go for it.
So I would say it's possible to do it without offset also. Important thing is that yes, the technologies which we are talking, carbon capture utilization or replacement of fossil fuel, that would be required, and that is possible. And that would happen also, because the way we have charted out our program, without offset, we are going to be net zero and then carbon negative also. Thank you.
Any other input?
Yeah, I think when we decided to, we still have a primarily reduction-based strategy, but I think there are precious few businesses and precious few industries where you can actually get to net zero with reduction alone. I think the science is just really challenging across the board. And it depends on what you define as reduction, of course. If you invest in renewable energy in developing countries, does that count as abatement? Is that an offset, or is that actual a net reduction? So I think some of the terminology is a little challenging, but I think the IPCC report from a year ago is pretty clear. I think we have got to get rid of the stigma around offsets and removals and start focusing not about how we should use them, or not if we should use them, but how we use them and how we define them. And I think the one other piece that is really important in that is that it needs to be both clearly defined and also part of a clearly defined strategy. Companies that are relying on offsets and removals alone are not transforming, and the whole title of this panel is Transform to Net Zero. You don't get to a net zero economy by doing business as usual and then trying to balance it out on the balance sheet. The science is just never going to work out in what we have in a market to get there fast enough. So I think we need to start opening the door a little bit to all of the above solutions, get rid of a little bit of the stigma, but really hold the bar on quality as we open up those gates.
And I think just to also emphasize, to invest in the solutions that we have, to scale the solutions we have today, point one, to invest in the solutions we need for tomorrow, in addition to opening the door to a lot of these issues, because it can't be about slowing down the investments of today. I'll take one more question from the floor.
Yes. Hello. Alexander Hakopian, the part of the delegation from Armenia. My question is, if we look at the transformation and the development from COP21 until COP26, it's changed so much that people are starting to take action, and the trend line is that every person who is not sort of sustainability curious, as you said, Michelle, but are actually making a framework and making an effort to come closer to net zero. But my question is, it's more of a thought, and I want to hear what you think about it. It seems that every company is making their own strategy, making their own plan, and doing everything on their own. Maybe some collaborations, maybe small groups, but from my point of view, that could result in something that maybe one company does something better than the other, and maybe something that another company is doing is going to impact negatively the work that another company is doing. So what is your thought on actually making a big coalition and joining all of us into making this transformation to net zero? Because air, as we know, is a global thing, and carbon emissions are also global, which impact everybody. So what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, maybe what I'm going to do, just looking at the time, is I think that's a really great sort of framing and question, in a sense, to kind of pick up this notion of partnerships. How do we really scale partnerships to make this happen? And so maybe actually if I can ask each of our panelists just to sort of share a quick response to that, and you touched on this already, Roberto, around kind of these coalitions, partnerships within industry, but I think also beyond, call it the coalition of the willing. I think one of my big challenges is we always have the same business leaders on the stage. How do we help kind of expand this group in order to truly transform all of economy? So maybe just a quick reflection from each of you to this as sort of like, let's say, a closing reflection of this conversation before we pass on to our closing remarks.
No, I think it's a very good question. You know, the half glass full is that, to your point, we are seeing here more companies, private sector, than ever before. So it is becoming like a must-do. And I also think that there is no alternative. There is no plan B. So either you get on the boat or you get out of the boat, and good luck with that, right? Because we've just seen that there is this pressure coming from society, from everybody, in terms of the awareness becoming much more prominent. So that's good news. The challenge is exactly to your point, how we make sure that the efforts are somehow converted into actions in a consistent way. And we talk a little bit about the fragmentation, lack of clarity, lack of definition. You know, regulation of the carbon market is so important because we'll actually establish some baselines and guidance in terms of how to operate. So I completely agree that, again, we talk about partnership, collaboration, all stakeholder approach. And this is not just semantic. It needs to happen, because if people end up taking very isolated effort, we're not going to be able to really get the scale that we're talking about to be able to revert some of those current trends. So it's the right challenge, and hopefully in forums like that, we're going to be able to get to more clarity on definitions, on convergency of things, that then people will have a common criteria how to operate.
Michelle, just in a few minutes.
I think about it as finding the right places for collaboration and the right places for competition. I think there's a lot of emphasis on collaboration, and rightly so. The good news is there are a lot of places for us to do a better job of doing that, and for different people, to your point, to do that. When we started Transform to Net Zero about 1.5 years ago, it was exactly with that aim. It wasn't to get Unilever and Microsoft and Natura together to talk about how great we were. It was this phrase around the fast follow. How do the leaders who have already cleared some of the way really take and make that a template, easy to implement approach to get everybody else? I think everybody looks at, like, well, look at the growth of like the FTSE 100 following on. I care about the Fortune 500, but the Fortune 500 already cares. I want to get beyond that group to start to think about how we get them on board. So it's a global business coalition and not just a coalition of the, top earners across the board. So thinking about the right places for collaboration there while maintaining competition, because we should not be competing on who has the most ambitious targets. We should be competing on who gets there furthest and fastest with the most effective technologies or solutions to get there.
Super. I think that's a great remark. 30 seconds. Your reflections on this point.
Yeah. So to multiply the impact of the actions which are taken for implementing clean technologies, I think transparency is very important. It has to be shared, and organizations like CDP, Women Business, BSR, FMC, etc., they can highlight what action has been taken, what success, what failures by any organization, so that one, wheels doesn't get reinvented, but at the same time, collaborative efforts do happen. And this is what we are seeing in last 3 years after we announced our carbon negative roadmap, that many organizations have supported us, given us good idea how to implement it. As well, we also published in our all reports as well in global conferences that what we are doing. So it is must to implement faster this transformation.
Super. Thank you. Lorena, last couple
Yeah,
words.
I totally agree with what he proposed. There are already a number of associations around this topic, and I think that every company, regardless the size, should be part of, especially the small company, because they don't have enough resources to do it and can be helped by big leaders like, for example, like Hitachi. So I totally agree with you, and creating its own strategy will never help. So we are a stronger support of collaboration, and that's what we have been doing.
Super. No, thank you. And I mean, I think an excellent sort of set of reflections as we close this. We need more collaboration, absolutely, to kind of drive this transformation faster. And I think on that note, this session has also been organized in collaboration with a number of organizations, including the CDP. So I'd like to invite Paul Simpson, the CEO of CDP, who will kind of share with us closing remarks and hopefully answer all of the unanswered questions that we've discussed on this stage today to take us further and faster.
Well, as I like to say on the #1 climate change podcast in the world, my name is Paul Dickinson, and I'm the founder chair of CDP. But thank you so much to the panelists, the partners for sharing. And this is the delivery COP, right? And so I cannot think of a better conversation to be having on this topic. And CEOs and boards must be considering their entire value chain, and we need really new business models. And on that one, I really want to call out Microsoft and Michelle, talking about scalable models that are replicable for others and removing all historical emissions. If everyone does that, we're at 350. I mean, wow. And I also, Mahendra, talking about happy to abate sectors. That's absolutely fantastic. CDP #1 company putting margin and increased value into what was formerly a commodity. That's absolutely stunning. It's your companies that are the lion, and we just, at CDP, get to give you the roar. But I mean, the first step here is accounting, fundamentally and primarily. And we are delighted that 13,000 corporations reported through CDP in 2020, and 2,000 of them set science-based targets. And last month, we had the launch of the net zero standard by the Science Based Targets Initiative. And it's the first science-based target, net zero target, that can be verified. To coin a phrase, no blah, blah, blah. And I think it's time we have process to underpin what we're doing together. Robust frameworks that can support accounting to stakeholders, which are employees, investors, citizens, that's a great phrase, and governments, of course. And we need rapid and deep reductions in emissions across the entire value chain. Now, there are 7 companies that have already come forward and have approved net zero science-based targets, and 600 are making commitments to achieve that before 2050. And we urge others to join. Now, there are things we need. We need technology, but we also need governments and policy. This is a time for science-based policy, and I actually want to draw attention to that incredible discussion that we were having about as Roberto said, we need partnering in transition and talked about citizens as being part of this. And Lorena talked about innovation and collaboration, and really cool that you're in the train business. That's a great business. So we are, I think, moving towards some kind of global settlement with a coalition of the willing. That was another fantastic phrase. And what does that mean for corporations? Well, right now, we have to turn these commitments into action. And 1.5 degrees is about action in the next 5 years. It's actually about taking action today. But the good news is that citizens, as they experience extraordinary extreme weather, people being flooded in New York or in trains, in subway trains in China, or the fires in California or Australia, the children on strike, this is all bringing together a critical moment where anything is truly possible. And I think investors, corporations, and governments can all play a part. Governments are taking action, and we've seen improved and ever-improving NDCs. NDCs are kind of CDP for countries, if you will. And I'm very glad that they're moving from 5 years to possibly 2 years or even annual. And if the UNFCCC would like any help with their carbon accounting, I'm sure CDP can support them. But to end on a really serious note, I want to conclude by saluting the leadership here in this room and to all the companies that have come forward. It now seems investors and corporations are ahead of government, which is exactly what we want, because that then creates the space where government can follow. You know, industry here, there's a saying, the union makes the force, and we can see here a huge ecosystem of corporations supporting each other with investors. I heard the phrase earlier, people need the finance for this. 2 weeks ago, I interviewed the chief executive of HSBC. I said, are you going to lend more money to companies who are involved in carbon reduction? He said, yes, we absolutely will. The money's there, 130 trillion we discovered this week. So with regard to transforming stakeholders for net zero, I'd just like to conclude by saying that we can do it, we must do it, and we will do it. Thank you. Together.
Great. Thank you, Paul. And I think with that, thank you to our viewers online, and thank you to the panel, as well as the partners, CDP and BSR, in convening the session today. So thank you very much to everybody.